intellectually, as it were, until I was in grad school in my PhD program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And even then, it was just, some of my friends and I really liked horror movies, and we were watching them a little bit more critically than I had done before that. That was in the 90s. But then, I finished my dissertation, which was actually not on horror at all. It was on 19th century American women's literature. But there was this cache of documents that I found that turned out to be fictionalized narratives of female serial killers in the 19th century. At first, I thought they were real. I was like, wow, were there really all these female serial killers in the 19th century in the US? But they were all fictionalized. And so I started getting interested in those, and then sort of in crime more generally. And I have to say that is all I write about, research, and teach at this point is horror. I guess one of my favorite, two of my favorite television shows from slightly different time periods. First was Doctor Who. And, for me, it was sort of John Pertwee and Tom Baker. There were a lot of Doctor Who narratives back then that were very horror adjacent. I was terrified of the Daleks, and I was terrified. There was this one Doctor Who serial from the 70s called The Green Death that was about these giant white slugs. And then Scooby-Doo. I think a lot of people would perhaps a little shamefacedly point out that Scooby-Doo, especially the original from the late 60s and 70s, was kind of a gateway into horror. It definitely was for me. I loved Scooby-Doo. Even then, I didn't really find it scary, but just loved it.
When did horror start to kind of cross over for you? Like you mentioned, you looked into more like the true crime stuff. You found, and like the female serial killers of the 19th century. But eventually, once you get your PhD and everything, when did you kind of start to think, okay, I think horror is something that should be taught. I think this is something that there's a lot of educational value to understanding the genre as a whole and stuff like that.
Probably quite a few academics start when they end up in horror, and that's with the Gothic, because you've got the Gothic and you've got horror, and the Gothic is somehow way more respectable. It has a long literary and academic tradition. But then I started putting in some straight horror, and I really began to realize that there was nothing sort of schlocky or lowbrow or less complex, less thought-provoking about horror. And so I really disagree with that sort of highbrow Gothic that can be taught at university, lowbrow horror. Like, why are you teaching that at university? I really disagree with that distinction. I think horror films, and there's some horror I won't teach, some I won't watch, but there's so much horror that's intellectually rich, thought-provoking, and should be in college classrooms, in my view. I won't teach horror films that are sadistic, focused on torture. Definitely, I don't teach any rape films, even though rape revenge is an interesting and sort of feminist subgenre of horror.
First off, what is that class? And then also, when it came to making that class happen, I'm assuming that wasn't a course that was already there once you got to Lehigh University. So what was it kind of like building that class up from the ground, essentially?
Well, I've got 2 courses in the catalog now that weren't in the catalog before, and I'm fortunate that Lehigh and Lehigh's English department are very flexible. I mean, if a faculty member really wants to teach a class and there is student interest, there are really no barriers to you teaching it. So I teach Introduction to Horror at the sort of lower level undergraduate curriculum, and then I have a advanced horror studies or something, which is a upper level undergraduate course. I mean, I do, with the introduction to horror class, I do want students to have a sense of the history of the horror tradition. I mean, most of them know horror, they've seen it, but you know, they mostly just know horror from 10, 15 years ago. A few fans have watched like 80s horror or something, but I want them to see the entire arc of the US horror tradition, those films that really changed the game. And so I want students to understand that horror, most important of genres, it thinks about humans' existential condition. It thinks about particular social and cultural and political anxieties at any given moment. You know, decade by decade, you can look at a horror film and see what Americans were worried about. You can see what they were worried about in the 1930s, in the 1950s, in the 2000s.
So I'm assuming you probably start the Universal monster movies, yeah, then kind of work your way up to like the Atomic Age of like the 50s B movies. Then eventually you kind of get into like 60s. What are kind of just some of the like main films that you really kind of focus on when you're teaching the class?
The game-changing films. I mean, well, I think you have to start with Dracula in 1932. I mean, that's generally considered sort of the first US sound horror movie. So I would say The Thing from Another World and Invasion of the Body Snatchers together encapsulate the fear of the bomb, the fear of alien invasion, the fear of communism, those things that seem so on the surface. You have to teach Psycho. You know, Psycho is one of those, 1960, everything changed in Psycho. You saw blood for the first time. You saw the threat being a really, you know, it was an American threat. It was at home in a safe space. The Blair Witch Project from 1999 was a game changer. And Get Out from 2017 was also a game changer. I would probably include Texas Chainsaw Massacre in there too. I mean, that's when exploitation movies started like full throttle. You know, the lowbrow gore. The film actually is not that gory, but obviously it has the reputation for being so, and it is terrifying. I think even students today, 50 years after the fact, find Texas Chainsaw Massacre very disturbing.
So with Get Out, so I think many would say that Get Out was obviously a game changer for many reasons, but one of the things was I think it really helped a lot of people kind of reevaluate horror because it's one of the few horror films that really got awards attention. So far in the course of horror history, really, only one horror film has ever won Best Picture, and that's The Silence of the Lambs. And then, like, it's a genre that is often frowned upon by, or was often frowned upon by, like, critics and audiences, as lowbrow entertainment. But now, like, you have movies like Get Out, you have movies like Talk to Me, you have a studio like A24 that's releasing these, I guess you could say, more esteemed, or what they qualify as more esteemed horror films. But why do you think, one, horror is or was frowned upon genre, and then why do you think that it's the contrary? It is important. Horror is a very important genre. There's a lot of really important, impactful things. You can look at it through the lens of Get Out. You could just look at it through the lens of, you know, like those films as a whole.
I think the reason horror has been sort of shunned as kind of low art, if it's art at all, is because it does center you know, views of the human that we don't really want to acknowledge or recognize. I mean, Stephen King, who is, you know, has to come into this interview somehow because he's, you know, the king of horror. I mean, he has this great quote in his book Dance Macabre, in which, you know, he sort of writes about, it's a nonfiction book, but he says something about the reason we watch horror, the reason we make it, the reason we need horror is because you've got to keep the gators fed. And, you know, he has this metaphor of sort of a trap door below the house, and it's full of, you know, alligators swimming around in the dark. You know, that's what horror feeds, the alligators swimming around in the dark. And, you know, King says you feed them with horror so they don't get out. You know, and the implication is if there was no art that was horror that tapped into these impulses and anxieties, we'd act on them. And so King is like, that's why you need art that serves as a sort of release valve. But that's generally, you know, like lots of people just look away, you know. Humans aren't like that. You know, humans don't have this darker side. Just like we don't like to look at death. And, you know, finally, horror movies are all about death in some form. But we mostly like to live as if that didn't exist. Horror doesn't let us live in that sort of illusion that death doesn't exist. But yeah, I mean, I think horror has become more respectable. I mean, the term you're looking for is elevated horror. You know, that's been the term, and Get Out was considered elevated horror. There's a bunch of others. But to my mind, there's always been elevated horror. It's not that Get Out invented it. There's always been really good, you know, narratively and aesthetically kind of brilliant horror movies. I mean, how can you not say that Psycho is elevated horror? So most horror fans don't like the term elevated horror because they would say there's always been that strand of horror running along with the sort of lowbrow exploitation horror. It's always been both of those terms.